Thank you. Excuse me for having my coat on, but I think my blood just runs cold from some of these discussions, and I just cannot warm up. So I came to Philadelphia to talk to the APS about my new book about Madame Curie, and the first thing that happened was that I had an encounter with Madame Curie, unlike any I've had in the years I spent writing this book. That thanks to a meeting with Michelle McDonald and Adriana Link, I saw the APS holdings that pertain to Madame Curie. And they include 2 handwritten letters from her. I was right there with those letters. The whole time I was writing the book, the pandemic kept me from the actual materials. But because Madame Curie is Madame Curie, everything of hers has been digitized, including lab notebooks, letters, the journal of her grief that she kept the year after her husband died, in which she actually spoke to him, the notebook in which she recorded the developmental accomplishments, landmarks of her 2 children. All of these things are available online. So I was hardly limited in the variety of material, but to see her actual letter was a real thrill. So these letters both came from 1910, the year she was inducted. And the first one is dated May, and it is her thank you to the organization for making her a member. So you might wonder, what had she done by 1910 that made her attractive to this organization? Well, she'd already won a Nobel Prize in physics. That might have been enough right there. But she had, through her doctoral dissertation work and what followed from that, she and her husband had discovered 2 new elements, because at the time she was working, the periodic table was still a work in progress with holes to be filled. And so they had discovered 2 elements, and they had explored this new science of radioactivity, which was her word. She coined that term to describe what was originally called uranic rays, a kind of radiation that came out of uranium and compounds containing uranium. And she showed that, first of all, by testing all the known elements, that there was only one other known element that emitted these rays. And when she found materials that were emitting the rays beyond what uranium or thorium could explain, she reasoned that must mean there's another new element that is radioactive. And if I try hard enough to break down the ore, I could find it. And that's what she did, twice. So, as I said, she worked with her husband. They shared the 1903 Nobel Prize in Physics with Henri Becquerel. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in any category, which made her instantly world famous. Then, in 1906, when her husband was killed in an accident, she was selected by the faculty in Paris to take over the laboratory where they had worked together, and to take over the teaching of his physics course. So she was the first woman to teach at this ancient university. So now she's doubly, triply famous, and certainly an attractive candidate for membership in the APS. So she thought enough to thank the organization in this handwritten letter. She did not have a secretary. By 1910, she had already started to do what interested me about Madame Curie, and that is to allow other women into the lab. So she's in charge now. She's world famous. Other women scientists all over the world see her as a magnet and this exciting new subject matter. So women started to come to her, to find their way to Paris. She didn't have to go hunt for them. All she had to do was not say no. And by 1910, she had 4 other women who were already working in her laboratory. So although she's the most famous woman in the history of science, she was never the only one, and she didn't want to be. Her second letter in the APS holdings, also from 1910, is dated toward the end of the year, when she was a candidate for election to the French Academy of Sciences, which, unlike the APS, had never admitted a woman. They had what they called immutable tradition. But her supporters felt that her distinctions, her achievements, were enough to overcome immutable tradition. And they put her name forward. And apparently she had some correspondence with the APS to gain support for her candidacy. So again, it was a thank you. Late in 1910. The vote was held in January of 1911, and she lost. This was such, talk about an election with embarrassing, maybe not as widespread, disastrous results, but it was really embarrassing. Here she is a pioneer in this field. But now, because she's not a member of the Academy, she cannot present the research results of her laboratory to the scientific community in the country. That's what it meant. So she has to continue doing what she's been doing, which is to go to a fellow faculty member and say, would you please read my paper at the next meeting, and so that it can be published in the proceedings. And that's what had to be done. And one of her reactions to that unfairness was that she stopped presenting at meetings. She stopped having the results from her lab presented at the meetings, and she published them elsewhere. The next document in the APS holdings relevant to Madame Curie is not a letter of hers, but a letter from a German scientist who happened to attend the first ever Solvay Council, which was held in Brussels in late October of 1911. So this was an invitation-only meeting of the top physicists in the world, about 25 people, would come together in a room and talk about the enormous challenges in the field. So radioactivity has been accepted now. People agree that elements actually change from one into another. This is not the alchemist's transmutation, but a bona fide natural scientific process is going on. Radioactivity is hinting at the structure of the atom. At the beginning, there was even disagreement about whether the atom was a viable model, the quantum physics. Albert Einstein was at this meeting. Ernest Rutherford was at the meeting. It was an extraordinary gathering of minds. She was, of course, the only woman in the room. The day the meeting ended, reports erupted in the popular press about a romance in the laboratory between Madame Curie and another participant in this meeting, Paul Langevin. And it was a giant scandal, a very embarrassing turn of events. And so this letter in German referred to the Solvay Council and said how she was much a focus of attention. But the letter was dated, I believe, November 18th, which means that it was written after this whole scandal broke, and a scandal in which Albert Einstein came to her defense. In the midst of all of this hubbub, on November 7th, her birthday, she discovers she has won a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry. And it's hers alone, not shared with anyone. She remains, to this day, the only person ever to have won in both physics and chemistry. So she was overwhelmed what to do about this in the midst of her scandal, and she offered not to come to the ceremony. And they assured her that no one believed this libel being printed about her. But between early November and December, when the prize ceremony is held, there was a lot more flap in the press and a couple of duels fought over it. So they really didn't want her to come and wrote to suggest that she absent herself from the award ceremony. And she just gathered herself together and said that I failed to see what scurrilous attacks on my private life have to do with the merit of my scientific research. And she showed up in Stockholm and she collected her prize. So the next document is dated, I believe, May in 1921, when she came here because she recovered her reputation by becoming a war hero. At the outbreak of the First World War, she immediately realized this would be the first time it would be possible to X-ray wounded soldiers. So she got someone to give her a car. She didn't even know how to drive. She got a car and she outfitted it with X-ray equipment and drove it to the front. And got her 17-year-old daughter to participate in this work. And then, because the need was so great, she put together a 6-week course for French women. They didn't have to be interested in science. They just had to have a basic education. Take my 6-week course. I teach you about electricity and X-rays and human anatomy, and then you can go out and do this work. She trained 150 women to do that work. And by the 1920s, she had many more women and men working in her lab. And she had turned the embarrassingly ill-equipped laboratory that she had shared with Pierre. I mean, one scientist who visited said it looked like a cross between a stable and a root cellar. And they couldn't believe that the work they had done had come out of that place. And now she was the head of an internationally recognized Radium Institute that was divided into two parts. So one part was the basic research and the production of these materials, which was her part. And then there was the medical part, because radium, it turned out, was the cure for cancer. So she is now lauded all over the world as a great humanitarian. And an American newspaper editor went to visit her in Paris and realized, for any number of reasons, Madame Curie didn't have enough radium to do her work. And so this woman, whose name was Marie Mattingly Maloney, went back to the United States and raised $100,000, which was the cost of a gram of radium, from the women of America. And they invited Madame Curie and her two daughters to come to this country. They arranged for her to collect honorary degrees from Smith and Pennsylvania, numerous places. They wore her out. She was a petite, frail woman. If you consider her X-ray exposure during the war, if you have dental X-rays, they put a lead blanket on you when the dentist walks out of the room. She was wearing a cotton smock. So they came here, and of course she was a member of the APS. So she came to a meeting, and they gave her the Benjamin Franklin Medal. And she talked a little bit about her work. And so the minutes of the meeting contain a description and interpretation of what she said. I think if you know what she actually did and you read the minutes, you can put it together. But it isn't really a great description, whereas her descriptions are terrific. She wrote with great clarity. In fact, in 1910, when she was inducted, she had written an important 2-volume textbook on radioactivity, which included the work of all the scientists in that field, not just her work. So she really was here. And my interest in her really was not to write a full biography. There are several biographies of Madame Curie. Probably many of you have read at least one of them. The first one was written by her younger daughter. It came out in the 1930s and was turned into a movie starring Greer Garson as Madame Curie. But what got me interested was the discovery that about 45 women had passed through her laboratory, which is something that is not covered in any of the biographies. And that was my story. And it was my story because of what happened to me writing my previous book, The Glass Universe, during which I was constantly surprised by what the women scientists had done. And I finally had to admit that having grown up in the 1950s, I had absorbed a kind of misogyny, a lethal discounting of women. And it was awful to realize that. And then it was even more awful to discover I wasn't alone. I had asked Alyssa Goodman, who was a professor of astronomy at Harvard, to be one of my technical reviewers. And as she started reading the book, she said, "I'm sorry, I'm not really paying attention to your science descriptions. I am gobsmacked by these women. Here I am at Harvard. I know all their names. I know this story. But I always thought they were doing something cute or quaint. I never realized they were actually doing science." So there it was again. And I thought, wow, if the two of us have this kind of misogyny, how widespread is it? And I think after last Tuesday, we have our answer. So All right. Concludes my remarks.
Thank you. After that inspiring presentation about an exemplary APS member, I hope there are some questions for Dava.
There's one.
There we go, right there. Please give your name and place.
Betty Ruth Walter, University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. And she is always referred to as Madame Curie. She had many advanced degrees.
Yes, she
Any
did.
other male professor would have been professor or doctor. Was she ever addressed or considered other than Madame Curie?
She was, but she went by that title voluntarily. She also used her maiden name, Sklodowska, so she signed some things Marie Sklodowska Curie. But her textbook is signed Madame Pierre Curie. And she used Pierre's picture as the illustration, not her own. I'm sorry, I don't
Yes,
see where.
yes.
Oh, on the balcony.
Please name and place.
Louise Hanson. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I live on Long Island. I had been at Brookhaven National Laboratory. I was wondering what languages, for instance, her private notebook that you said has been translated, or the letters that were sent to the APS, where anything. I mean,
They're in French.
They're all in
Everything
French.
is in French.
Everything.
Yes.
She didn't
Yes.
write notes in
It's
Polish.
digitized. She wrote in Polish to her family. But those letters to her family appear in the original biography. And I believe that during the Second World War, the originals were all lost. So I think the only record of most of that is in Eve Curie's book, which is called Madame Curie. Another.
Yes, yes. So my mother, in fact, was very inspired by that book.
I learned yesterday from John Mather that Senator Barbara Mikulski was also inspired by that book. Some other people I could name, Angela Merkel and Fabiola Giannotti at CERN, who actually had to choose between a career in music or in physics, and because of Madame Curie, chose physics.
Other questions? We have time. I have one while we await others. Dava, I was, as a 9-year-old girl, reading a biography of Marie Curie, which was incredibly inspirational. Do you know how many biographies have been written? Because I think she was a mainstay of public libraries for young women and young men in the late 50s and 60s. And I wonder, has this continued, this growth of almost hagiography?
Yes, there have been more. Have I made a count? I know I've read them all. There are probably 12 or 15, and they're not all positive. People take shots at her. You know, it's an all too familiar trope that women do a different kind of science. Women do the boring, repetitive things, and the men just have aha moments. And she is accused of that. She is accused of using her hands but not her head.
Are we going? Yes, there we go. In the back, please.
Dava, can you talk a little bit about the number of women, if you will, who have won Nobel Prizes subsequent to Marie and Iran, and the incidence of that happening, you know, over the course of the last 100 years?
Yes, this is my editor, publisher, George Gibson, who has a family, wonderful historical ties to the APS. very few women have won Nobel Prizes in the sciences. The second woman to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry was Irene Curie, who had followed her parents into the lab, like her mother, married her lab partner, and found great success. There wasn't another one for a long time. And I forget the exact numbers because, I'm not young, I'm not running for president, and statistics don't, but I have to share with you, I am 77, which is the atomic number of iridium. and, and, and I like this age because of all the metals, iridium is the least susceptible to corrosion.
That's lovely.
So there are only about, there's maybe 7 chemists and 8 physicists altogether. And some women have won in medicine, including Kathleen Carrico, whose wonderful book, Breaking Through, I read recently and can highly recommend.
There actually were 10. 10 altogether.
10 altogether.
10 altogether, chemistry and physics.
Thank you for correcting me, as you so often do.
Right at the back of the room. Name and place, please.
I'm Ruth Schwartz-Cowan. I'm from Irvington, New York. It cannot still be the case that there are no women admitted into the French Academy of Sciences. So when did the first one get admitted?
Yeah, well, the first one was one of the people she had hired in her lab, Marguerite Perret. But that didn't happen till the 1940s. And it was a quasi-membership. She was in a kind of honorary position. She couldn't really vote. And the first real one, Yvette, I'm sorry. I have it in my book. I'll look it up for you and tell you later. And that came much later. And she was a physicist at the Pierre and Marie Curie University. So it was dramatic, but it took a long time. Irene Curie actively tried 3 times. She applied and never got in.
One quick last question up here.
Mary Beth Norton, Ithaca, New York. I am, one of my hats is as a historian of women, and I was very struck by your comment about finally recognizing how many women had been completely ignored. And my reaction to that is it's a revelation that comes to us all, because it came to me at one point years ago, and it's come to many others, and I was appreciated your comment. And the other comment I had has to do with the marvelous Rosalind Franklin, completely ignored because of doing dull, boring work and not ever credited with her work for DNA. And I just wonder if you see that as another example of the sort of thing you're talking about.
Well, I think Rosalind Franklin has been recognized, loudly recognized. Now she has, yeah. At the time, not, yeah. Yeah, it's an all too familiar story. The women's names disappear. They fall off the published papers. They don't appear on the prize citations. It's been going on a very long time. Do I know what to do about it? No. The only thing I know how to do is write. So I'll just keep doing that and hope it has some. And I saw things in the collections that really interested me. I didn't come here with an idea for a new project, but now I think I might have one. So this could be the start of a beautiful relationship.